All right, I think this works. All right, hello. So I wanted to continue what I was working on yesterday, which was sub-interpreters. So at the end of the stream, I said I would like to, because I discovered, I guess, some issues. Let me just pause this. Discovered some issues in certain modules with sub-interpreters, like when I imported that module, it crashed or something weird happened. And thought instead of just trial and error, just discovering these modules, it would be good to find a way of like testing, running the CPython test suite, but in a sub-interpreter. So the CPython test suite is like this, basically like unit tests for everything in CPython. It is in the lib folder. So in the CPython source code inside lib, there's a folder called test. And in there, there's basically like either a test directory. So like if it's something complicated like JSON, there's a whole directory of tests. Or if it's something small, then there's like a single file. I say small, most of these are pretty big. So I thought, well, it would be good to, I reckon if you ran the test inside a sub-interpreter, then if that extension module was incompatible with sub-interpreters, then you'd discover pretty quickly that there's an issue. So I asked Eric yesterday, he said someone had looked at that before but not done it. I think Victor maybe had a look at it but hadn't done it yet. So I copied some code I had from Pigeon, which basically does something kind of similar, which gets a list of tests in the CPython test suite. So the CPython test suite has a module that you can import called find tests, and then there's a function that just gives you a list of all the tests. So I basically wrote a script that gets a list of tests, and then for each one of those tests, it runs that test in a sub-interpreter. So what I discovered when I did that was, let me just check. The readline module doesn't work, and I'll show you. Let me hide the changes because I'm kind of halfway through a fix at the moment. Yeah, what I discovered was, let me just comment this out and change it back to what it was before. I think that's what it was. It was something like that. Let me just have a look at the PR and I'll see if I can find it. Because I'll show you what the crash looks like, because it's interesting. Yeah, that looks right. Okay, so if I just recompile. And I'll show you where I started. So the comments are one of my fixes. So I've now reset it back to what it looks like. So CPython 3.13 main, the main branch. If you run this test suite, so I'm running my sort of test loader, I guess, that gets a list of all the CPython tests, and then it attempts to run each test in a sub-interpreter. So I'm doing that using unit test. The unit test package has a test loader, which you can basically give it a string and it will load that test name from the namespace. And then you can just call run on the test suite. So that's what I'm doing basically. This code here, this function is being run inside the subinterpreter. So I'm basically like going through a list of tests and starting that test inside a subinterpreter. And you can see, you know, we've got passes and failures, and there's some stuff that I wouldn't expect to work. So like some modules specifically are not supported in subinterpreters, and you get a nice import error. There's some things like setting event listeners and stuff like that, which don't work in subinterpreters. This one is an assertion that's failing because it's listing all the interpreters, and I guess that now is bigger than it would have been before because it's running in a subinterpreter, and that test never was written assuming that was not the case. Okay, so eventually we get this, which is not good, which is a segmentation fault. Segmentation faults happen because for a number of reasons, but the most common one is you're trying to read from memory that you don't own. So you're following a pointer that is not valid, or the pointer might be in null, for example. So you're trying to read from null, which you never want to do. So I got to this point yesterday, which I thought was interesting because, you know, CPython shouldn't crash like this. So why is that happening? And we can, if I just hard coded it to be the particular test that was failing, which is test built in, and then created a debug configuration in VS Code, so that I can basically, so if you're normally in VS Code, if you want to debug Python code, you'd click on like the debug button up here. But I don't care about the Python code as much as I care about the C code in the back end, because that's what's crashing. So what I'm using instead is the C++ debugger, which is on Mac is lldb, and it's going to launch the Python process with the same arguments I just gave it. And then I've got a few other little settings that I like to have for tracebacks and stuff like that. So if I run this, seg fault equals sad fault. Yeah, it does. So if I run this in VS Code, it will stop here because that is a setting called stop on entry. It basically means when it starts the program, it just pauses and waits for you to do things that you forgot to do. Oh, brilliant. I've got a whole bunch of random breakpoints. Let's remove them and then just wait for it to explode. Okay, cool. We have an explosion. So in VS Code, you've got the debug console, which is the lldb console. So you can type in lldb commands. lldb is the debugger for C++ code on Mac OS. You can install it on Linux as well, and you can install it on Windows. But most people for Linux would use like GCC for compiling, and then use GDB as a debugger. And then on Windows, they would use MSVC as the C and C++ compiler, and then the debugger that comes with that. But I'm on Mac, so I'm using this one. VS Code abstracts that away for you, so it doesn't really matter. But I get this lovely little stack trace on the left-hand side, so I can see in C where did it crash. And you get this error code, which on a Mac means that it's trying to read from somewhere that it shouldn't do. And you can pretty quickly see why. And that's because the Python object that it's trying to determine the type of is a null pointer. So 000 is null. So it's trying to read from a null pointer. So I can basically just unwind back through the stack to figure out why it's trying to read from a null pointer, and that's where I kind of got to this bug. So the bug is in the readline module. The readline module is in the standard library. It's written in C. It wraps around the readline utility for Linux and the one for Mac. I don't know what happens with Windows, like which library it uses, but basically it's a C extension module. So it's all written in C, and it basically allows you to like type things in. So when you're using the REPL, like that's what is used, I think, for readline. You can also do some really funky stuff with readline. Like you can set callbacks and stuff like that. I don't know if it's where the documentation is for it. Okay, here we go. So this describes the functionality, but so you can have interactive stuff. There is a built-in in Python called input, which you've probably used before. There's another module called RL completer. I have not got this one to crash yet, but it might do. But like I said, it's also got these like startup hooks. So you can give it a Python function that calls when readline initializes. And I also thought, okay, like how when you're looking at code that crashes, it's often good to see like when was the last time someone changed this? Did they change it recently? Has it introduced a bug? So I had a look at the blame for this module, which made me realize how old this code is. So I'm looking like here on this line. This is 10 years old. That's Antoine's picture. I think that's Antoine. Yeah. But like some of the code, the end of that function is 22 years old. There's some comments in here from like even further back. I think I saw like 22 years, 26 years. So Guido made some changes to it 26 years ago. So this is old code. So if there was an obvious bug in it, then you would have thought that somebody would have already come across this bug. But like I was saying on the stream yesterday, running things with multiple gills uncovers weird bugs. And the weird bug here is this, and this took me best part of an afternoon to figure out. But okay, if we unwind a bit, so what's happening is it's importing readline, which goes into this function called pyimport load dynamic module with spec. There are two ways to initialize a C extension module. One is a single phase init, and the other one is a multi-phase init. A single phase init basically means that you have one function that gets called, like an init function that does creates the module object from a spec. It adds all the attributes, it does any custom initialization code, and then it returns back a fully working module at the C level. The other option is a multi-phase init, which it creates a module spec first, gives that back to CPython's initial like module loaders, and then it calls like a setup method. And there's a couple of other hooks for that. The PEP is PEP 489. This PEP was actually introduced partly related to subinterpreters because it basically means that like the initialization of an extension module can be more flexible. So it kind of adds like a dunder init, I guess, to the module. Most of the extension modules have been changed to use multi-phase init. Readline is not one of those. So that was interesting. Now, why is this crashing? I'll summarize this because it took ages to get. Readline's init method, which is this one, does a few things. It creates the module. It adds some constants. It gets something called a module state. A module state is a custom bit of memory that you can put stuff in that's related to the state of the module. In the case of readline, that is this data structure here, and it includes pointers to the hooks that you configured. So basically, like, that is a module state. It's like a custom, like a dictionary, I guess, but like a C structure. And it checks if that module state is null, which it isn't. You know, it has initialized the module state. It then calls a setup function, which initializes the GNU readline. GNU readline runs, and it runs another initialization method, which initializes GNU readline. In this code, it set a, where is it? A hook. Here we go. RL startup hook. And that hook is a C hook. So this says when readline is started, when GNU readline is initialized, because it's like a third-party library, then call this function. This function's the one that's crashing. So what basically happens, and the reason it's crashing is because it initializes readline. It sets a callback hook, which is this one, to say, okay, when readline has started, then call this bit of code here. It then continues back in this PyImport module loader. So this function, basically, it imports readline twice. The first time, it does the initialization. It continues. It gets to here. It says, this package is not compatible with subinterpreters. It raises an exception. It sets an error. But it's already set a callback in the initialization. So where it's crashing basically is the second time you import. So the first time it failed, but it basically runs the callback anyway. So even though it failed to import the module, it calls the callback, and in the callback, it assumes that this macro here assumes that the module had imported successfully. So this readline state global is just a macro that says PyState find module, and then the result of that give to PyModule get state. PyModule get state is failing because the module is null, and the reason it's null is because it didn't import in the first place. So the bug is that readline, when you import readline, when it starts the import, when it initializes the module, it sets a callback that says, hey, when readline's initialized, like the GNU readline, not the Python one, then call this C function. It continues through the import process. The import process fails. It raises a nice clean exception, but then in another part, it then calls that hook. It gets here, and then there's no error checking to see if the module even imported successfully in the first place. So it segfaults. That was the answer. It took a while to get there. Now, I guess how did no one ever come across this before? And that is because no one ever encountered a path where the import of readline would fail. That's the only thing I can think of, is that no one had ever got it to fail to import in the first place. Because otherwise they'd have seen this crash. Like, this is not really related to subinterpreters. I mean, the reason it failed is because subinterpreters said, hey, this is a single phase init, therefore it's not supported, and it raised a clean exception. But the hook still is not checking whether the result of the first function call, like, it doesn't, you can see here, like, that doesn't, there's no thing here that says, oh, if that's null, then don't pass a null variable to this function. It just runs, and this macro is all over this function. So like, it's used all the time. So I kind of thought, well, that's kind of where we got to, was to fix this. These callbacks, I guess there's a couple of ways to fix it. One is that if it fails to import, you should remove the callbacks. That was something that kind of got discussed, was that if the initialization failed, then we should remove the callbacks. But I think step one was actually just make this code better, so that, and I'll just revert it to the change that I had before. Okay, so the bit that I commented out was kind of what I'd worked on as a partial fix, at least, which is, instead of using that macro that I just showed you, actually write it out by hand. And that is, okay, the startup hook's been called. First of all, acquire the GIL. And the reason we're acquiring the GIL is because startup hooks can call a Python function. So you need the GIL to do that. So acquire the GIL, get the find the module, find the readline module, and assign it to a variable called null. If that variable if module is null, if that broke, then actually do something with that condition, which was release the GIL, see if an exception has been set, and if it hasn't, then set one, which is an import error, and then return -1. I know there was some comments here I wanted to work through. I wish. Let me go to GitHub because it's easier to see it in GitHub. Okay, so I submitted that change as a pull request, but made some comments in the pull request to say, okay, that's one hook, and at least this is the one that I came across. But maybe if people had set like a different hook, like there's other ones as well, like the pre-input hook. And when I looked at the pre-input hook, then that would probably have the same bug, because that just gets find module and then just passes it to module get state. So like, that's probably going to crash as well. I haven't reproduced that, but I would assume that would crash. And there's some other hooks which are not mentioned in the documentation, but they also look susceptible to the same bug. On completion, I don't know even how you would set the hook if you can't import the module. So I think the only hooks I need to worry about are the ones which are being set in the initialization function, which is here. And those are startup hook, pre-input hook, flex complete, that one looks like it would also break. Okay, so these two definitely. I worked on fixing this one, which was, okay, so let's try and see if the module has even loaded. If it hasn't, then don't just segfault. Let me just GitHub's got this really nice thing where people make suggestions and you can just accept them. Yeah, so Eric made a couple of suggestions here. I'll come back to those. Okay, first thing is to move the GIL release to after. So move it down, that's fine. That makes sense. This is an option, so I'm going to come back to that. The likelihood of mod getting... Okay, so this is because I added a reference to the module where it didn't have one before. Dong Hee said, okay, well the else is in the... Like, that else is unnecessary because that is a return statement. Therefore, the flow of that code would always go into the... Like, that else doesn't need to be there is what he's saying. So... like that code makes more sense. That space doesn't need to be there either. I'll just resolve it because I've done it by hand. So I just give myself a conflict. Okay, that's fine. So I think I'll tackle these one at a time. So what Eric's saying is that instead of, like, I'm setting an error message here, I should probably also like remove the hook, because the hook's still set, right? So this startup hook was set in the initialize function to RL startup hook, but it failed. Therefore, we should set that to be null. Because it'll keep running and it's not going to work the second time around, would it? But then I guess if it ran if you imported readline from a sub interpreter and it failed the first time, but then if the second time around you imported it from the main interpreter and it worked, then it would still run this code and it would still set it the second time. So that's fine. Okay, so right. Okay, so first things first, let me just test this first. Okay, so now when you run test built in, it successfully works. The tests don't pass because the built-in test actually tries to do a signal, which you can't do in a sub-interpreter, but other than that, the other tests work. So it no longer segfaults, so we've kind of fixed the bug, I guess, but there's some other things to do. So he suggested basically having a cleanup function, which I guess would go... Let's just see if there's another one called clear or something. Readline free, readline clear. You know what? I think that's a bug because what? Oh no. So it's clearing. Okay, so pyclear is like a deck ref and then set it to 0 from what I remember. Like it basically, or like clear that pointer. So readline clear, which is clearing that these fields, right? It's clearing that from the state. There is no state because it didn't import the module in the first place. So we don't want to call this function because that'll probably just crash anyway. Because you can't clear the module because it never got imported. The thing we want to do is like remove the hook, which was like this one. So we want to, this is defined here, which is readline.h. This is like the Mac OS version of it, but this would link you to the Linux version if you're on Linux. So that's a pointer to a function, and a function is defined as having a string and an integer. And there are two hooks, RL startup hook and RL pre-input hook. So I think what Eric was suggesting is that you set RL startup hook to null. Or do a cleanup readline, which is a new static function that undoes everything setup readline did, especially unregistering all the hooks. Okay, so let's try and do that because that is a better solution, and I don't want to rush this. So let me just split the window so I can see both. Clean up readline. Okay, so that takes no parameters. It will that is only set if that def exists, which I'm guessing is like a feature of readline. So I guess I have to make that conditional. What else? RL initialize? Is there like an uninitialize? No. Okay, we said that one's probably going to break, isn't it? Yeah, that one will break. So we want to unregister that one as well. Okay, that's probably it. What does that do? Restore the terminal to its initial state and remove the line handler. This may be called from within a callback as well as independently. So it basically does the opposite of RL callback handler install. And that gets... I don't think we need to do that. I don't think that's ever going to get touched. So that's fine. Okay. Yeah, it's bugs all the way down. So, okay, so also this is the super advanced debugging method where you just put print statements in C code. But let's run that cleanup code now. So sweet, okay. What did I do wrong? Does this file have a header? I don't understand how these clinic things work. There's like a header in what am I doing wrong? I don't understand. Does this have a header file? Where is the header file? I don't understand. This is the thing I always just kind of ignored. This is why this is a thing called clinic. I'd never... I don't know if you have to edit it manually. Start generated code. Okay, so I'm assuming that doesn't... ran anyway. And the cleanup method got called, so that's good. It gets called lots of times because it keeps the tests keep trying to import readline, which is expected. So the code is working. I guess that's one victory. I don't understand what I've done wrong. This is just me being not really know what I'm doing. I'm going to come back to that because let's fix this one first. Okay, so this one will also break, but I haven't been able to reproduce it yet, but it will be the same issue. So it's kind of similar, I guess, but this just pre-input hook is called instead of startup hook. So I'm pretty sure, yeah, I can just copy and paste the code. Problem solved. There we are. I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. Also, that the free function, I feel like that should actually reset the hooks as well. Surely, that's a separate issue, but. Oh, right. It's saying I need to put... Really? Have I just been spending too much time on C++? Yeah. Right, okay. That's weird. Okay. Okay, so we've hardened the second hook. But that's not all the bugs, because what I was mentioning earlier was that when you use that macro, where is it, this one, wherever that macro is used, that's error prone anyway, because there's nothing in here saying, oh, if that is null, then don't run the second thing. But it's used 17 times. So I feel like you'd have to basically fix all occurrences of this, which is going to be fun. can just do them one at a time. Which will be this, basically the same code that I had before, which is if I'm going to have to do this a lot, I probably want to make it a function. So there is already a state that takes the module. Module get state. That doesn't find the module. So I feel like this should... If I just... See what I could just do is make another version of this that doesn't take any arguments, so just do an overload, and it just returns null if there's an error condition, which apparently you have to do this. That's annoying. That's not what I want. Where was I? This one, okay. So okay, that should be cleaner now. Okay, so if I implement that function, then this one does it cleanly. If the state is null, return null. Null means error in Python. And in my function, then I do this, and then like that should work then. Okay, yep. Fine. Do it in the right order. All right, that's one done. I don't know if... should at least like check that an error has been set as well. That sounds good to me. All right, that's one. Next one. Two. Copy this code. Three. Four. Five. Six. 7, 8. Where to do this one? There. Do it earlier. Okay. C function to call the Python completer. Does that ever return null? Yes. Oh. Any others? Oh man, how would you even do this one? I mean, that makes more sense to me. What? Okay, that's done. Delete it now. So in one of those cases, I don't want an error. That was the last one, I think. Okay. I do want an error, 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 I do want an error. This one. It's going to return a result. So if there is no state, then it's set an exception. I think I'm just going to add an argument to it. I'm spending too much time in other languages. C does not support default arguments. I can't even remember. I haven't had any C code for ages. What's it going to be by default then? I can't remember how to do anything in C. Spending all this time in C++ and it just rots your brain. Anyway. Okay, that doesn't explode. That's good. Let's try and run it normally. That worked. Is there a... I don't even know if there is a test read line. Okay. All right, I'm going to wrap up the stream. It's been an hour, but yeah, I think I've worked it out. But maybe just to look at these test failures and see if that was me that did this, and if not, what's going on. All right.